Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Alex Howlett, an independent scholar affiliated with the Gresham Institute and the Institute for New Economic Thinking's Young Scholars Initiative. He writes about monetary theory and the economics of universal basic income, also known as UBI. Alex advocates what he calls a calibrated basic income, which is a UBI high enough to prevent unproductive job creation. I welcome Alex Howlett to Savage Minds. I'm very happy to have you on the show, Alex. After reading your work and now even more of your work, I think this is a very important moment to be discussing these topics such as UBI and the implications for both what some might call economic health or the system and industry, and on the other hand, looking out for people. Because something I noticed while I was living in London during what was the LSX protests in the States, it was the Wall Street protest, is that I came across an enormous number of people living in, it was a tent city there right outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, and they would say to me things like, "We're going to one day all be automized so that none of us will have to work and we all can play video games." And to that one gentleman that mentioned the video games, I said, well, look, a lot of people like their jobs. And I was thinking back to a chaivala that I know that I would see almost on a daily basis. And we had talks about work, and even chaivalas in India who are at the bottom of the economic ranking, they like their work. He said, I love to get up every day and do my work, and I need to have a space away from my family. And so we started talking about what labor is, even in the context of a man who makes chai all day, every day, from early in the morning until just before dinner or sunset. So to the man in Tent City, I said, well, I can think of no greater torture than to play video games all day. Granted, there are a lot of bad jobs in this world that maybe we ought to consider they should all be consigned to robots. On the other hand, let's not denigrate what is labor that people enjoy, which is, of course, subjective. So in reading your work, I noticed that you take issue with certain kinds of proprietary historical models, as do many of us. And I thought maybe we could start by discussing some of the pillars that you go after, such as modern monetary theory, which is something that became formalized in the 1990s by a group of economists and former Wall Street trader. I'm thinking of Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, and Randall Wray.
Yeah.
That's right. And again, I have my economics training by airplane. Every time I took a plane in the past, I would buy a copy of The Economist and read, because I knew even if it wasn't my cup of tea and it wasn't within my studies, that this was very crucial to understanding class relations, even culture and society today, as it has always been. Let's face it, Marx was not just writing about money, he was writing about society. Okay, so I was wondering if maybe you could kick off by talking about MMT and what modern monetary theory means for us as a world society, and maybe in particularities to certain countries over others.
Okay, diving right into the deep end. So MMT stands for Modern Monetary Theory. As you said, it's kind of an offshoot of post-Keynesianism. So one of the big things that Keynes believed was that the big problem facing the economy in the 1930s during the Great Depression was involuntary unemployment. That people wanted to work, but the jobs weren't there. And this was a bad equilibrium that the economy had settled into, that it wasn't going to naturally kind of bring itself to full employment. So there's this kind of built-in assumption that full employment, there are various ways to define it, but making sure everyone who has a job, everyone who wants a job has a job, is one way of framing it. Is kind of also corresponding with the economy running at full steam, doing everything it can, operating at full capacity. Full employment means full production because you're using all your resources, so you're making all of the goods and services, that kind of thing. So this goal of bringing the economy to full employment is very central to Keynesianism, post-Keynesianism, and macroeconomics. So that's Keynesianism. There are people in the kind of Keynesian camp who are dissatisfied with how well we're doing in bringing the economy to full employment. So I want to say that I am not um, a Keynesian in this sense, but I want to be able to, if there's an MMTer listening to this, or post-Keynesian listening to this, I want to be able to describe it in a way where they say, okay, he basically has it right. So before I start, criticizing or anything like that, I want to make sure that I'm doing the best I can to kind of represent that point of view. So if so in the 1990s, there were three people who met on a post-Keynesian listserv on the internet, and their names were Warren Mosler, Randy Wray, and Bill Mitchell, as you mentioned. And they'd each come up with a similar idea for how to bring the economy to full employment. And it went by various names. One of the guys called it a job guarantee. Another one called it employer of last resort. I think Bill Mitchell called it an employed buffer stock of labor. The idea would be that our goal is to have the economy at full employment, is to kind of not just bring the economy to full employment, but kind of keep the economy at full employment in a stable way. So if the private sector, for whatever reason, maybe it's the business cycle, is on a downturn, that kind of thing, is not employing everybody, instead of having people suffer in unemployment and all of the problems that come with that, you could have a program whereby the government provides jobs. Like there's a list of jobs that are always available for people to work, and it pays a certain minimum amount. Something that is a reasonable kind of minimum wage. We expect people to be able to earn not just like a subsistence living, but a decent, kind of respectable living as citizens who are contributing to the economy, contributing to society. And if the government is always providing jobs, then they'll always be able to do that. Now, the concern among kind of mainstream Keynesians is that, oh, you can't just provide jobs to everyone because then that, well, it might cause inflation. So we're kind of trying to like get as many people employed as possible without overheating the economy. But the MMTers come back and say, well, if the economy is in a downturn anyway, right? This is just Keynes's insight. If the economy is in a downturn anyway, and the problem is that we're not employing enough people, then it's not going to be inflationary. It's just going to be anti-deflationary. It's going to prevent, the Great Depression or the economy from underperforming, right? So if yeah, so you've got unused capacity, right? You've got labor that's available that's not being used. If you employ that, there's got to be a way of doing that without causing inflation because you're actually, contributing more to the supply side of the economy. You're contributing more output rather than just input, rather than just kind of demand, like people spending more money, that kind of thing. So there should be a way to balance it out. So MMT kind of took this insight, employer of last resort, job guarantee, and they started thinking about kind of the nature of money. Like what is money fundamentally? There's a there's an economist, early 20th century economist, German economist by the name of George Knapp. And he had this idea that money was fundamentally an instrument that the government collects in taxes, right? So the classic MMT story that kind of like separates it from other kind of modern schools of monetary theory and economic thought, is this idea that that money is that the government imposes a tax on society that okay, everybody has to pay their taxes, and we're doing this because we want the government to have access to resources, right? So, um, but it's not efficient to say, give me, a certain amount of wheat and whatever, actual real resources. So you say, okay, everybody, you owe me, X dollars of money every year. And people will say, oh, but how do I give you that money? There's no such thing as money yet, or something like that. This is the stylized story, right? It's not. This isn't how it actually happens. There are specific contexts in which it can happen more like this or less like this. But the idea is that money is fundamentally a tax credit. So the government imposes a tax and then says, in order to earn the money to be able to pay your tax, you can come work for me, the government, and I will pay you the money. So that's what gives money its value. So it can't really be inflationary, right? Because the government is imposing the tax to mobilize this real kind of labor resource, and then the that is kind of the anchor of money to the real economy, is that it buys a certain amount of labor, and the price of labor is set by the government, because the government imposes the tax and says this is the wage that I will pay, so that you are able to meet your tax obligations. So money is fundamentally a tax credit, is something you might hear MMTers say. And then there are consequences of this. If you kind of follow the logic out, one of the most common things you'll hear about MMT is this idea that government deficits don't matter, that kind of thing. It's not actually that government deficits don't matter per se, but it's that the optimal deficit is not necessarily zero. It's not necessarily a balanced budget, because the whole point of what makes money go is that the government is spending money into the economy, right? And that there's money out there. So they spent more money than they collected in taxes. Otherwise, there's no money flowing, right? So there's this kind of circuit where money is going out and coming back in. So that's, I think, and you've talked to MMTers and you've read about MMT. How did I do?
Well, I actually am very new to the theories of
Okay.
MMT personally. I'm more of, I've read a lot of Marx, and
Okay.
I'm very familiar with Keynesian theory and many of the adherents to that, and then the Chicago School, and then the U.S. export of those folks theoretically and even practically to, let's say, Pinochet's government. And
Okay.
in a different way, I approach economics because it comes upon my path regularly. You argue for universal basic income, but it seems that you argue that our macroeconomic framework must put consumers first instead of workers to accurately reflect a healthy economy. Is that so? And if so, what does that mean in terms of other, let's say, UBI models?
Yeah, so when I say putting consumers first, I really mean putting people first. So I'm differentiating. I think, especially on the left in Marxism, we're kind of equating ordinary people with workers. The working class, that's everyday people, right? We are the ones who actually create the value in society, and a lot of that contribution is being exploited. The surplus value is being, this is Marx, right? The surplus value is being appropriated by the capitalists, that our labor creates, kind of this story about people as workers. So I kind of want to separate the idea of people from the idea of workers, and then question this idea, like, to what extent actually does it make sense for people to be workers? So that's what I mean when I say that the fundamental role is consumer. Because I mean, there's consumer and then there's consumerism. Like, these are not the same thing. Consumerism is you are kind of structuring your economy to get people to want to buy more and more and more stuff, right? And that's not necessarily very good for people and very good for resource use and that kind of thing. But then consumers is just, what does it mean to be a consumer? It means to receive the benefit that the economy can generate. So being a beneficiary of the economy kind of exists for the benefit of the people, and we want to optimize that. We want sustainable prosperity, right? Is the goal. Like, will we ever achieve it? I don't know, but that's, I feel like, normatively kind of what we want to be working toward, sustainable prosperity, and thinking of how do we maximize the well-being of the people. So that's what we mean by that's what I mean by prioritizing the consumer.
You've stated that basic income has nothing to do with taxes, but if taxes don't fund UBI in your model, what is their actual purpose in a CMT driven economy?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. I probably have said something like UBI has nothing to do with taxes. I think another way of thinking about it is that UBI is a kind of negative tax, right? Instead of collecting a certain amount of money from people, you are handing out a certain amount of money. So the particular kind of negative tax it is a negative head tax or a negative poll tax, maybe. That's a tax where you just say, okay, everybody has to pay me X amount of money in a given period of time. So UBI is a negative amount of that. So you can think of any increase in UBI as a decrease in the head tax. It's like right, these two things are kind of mathematically equivalent. Now we sometimes think that in order to do some kind of government spending, you have to kind of balance it. The revenue has to balance with the spending. We all know that governments can and do spend more than they collect in taxes, but we don't necessarily think that's a good or maybe even sustainable thing. So typically, I'm gonna say how people typically think of you. I'm gonna say what UBI is. So first of all, in terms of defining UBI, it's the same amount of money to everyone on an ongoing basis, usually from the government. It's an ongoing cash flow to every citizen on an individual basis, unconditional, obligation free. Sometimes people associate the term UBI or basic income with it being like an amount to be sufficient to provide for people's basic needs. I would say that this is, you can define work terms how you want. That's not what I mean by basic income or UBI. I use basic income and UBI as synonyms. Not everybody does. But we talked about MMT, particularly, when MMT people are using the term basic income, they usually mean, a direct cash benefit that is enough to cover people's basic needs, but it's not necessarily universal. It doesn't necessarily go to everyone. So when you hear me say UBI and basic income, that's not what I mean. I mean, UBI, it's universal. It goes to everyone. Not necessarily an amount that covers people's basic needs. It could be less, it could be more. It's a way of getting people money. It's not a certain amount of money. Um, and I also want to state up front that there are plenty of important problems that UBI doesn't solve. It solves one problem, I would say. And that problem is the problem of how to distribute money into the economy efficiently. I was at a conference, not this past summer, but the summer before, in Bath. It was the Basic Income Earth Network Congress in Bath, England, and I went around asking everybody there. These are all, for the most part, basic income supporters. I asked them, "What problem does UBI solve?" And everybody kind of gave a different answer. One guy from the Netherlands said, "Well, it can't be poverty because we've solved poverty, and we don't have poverty in the Netherlands," or something like that. I was like, "Pretty sure you have poverty in the Netherlands," but he kind of like his argument was that it has to be about more than that. I talked to someone who says UBI doesn't solve any problems, but it makes it easier to solve other problems, and blah 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 blah. I think everyone kind of in the UBI community has this sense that the economy could be serving people better, and that UBI is an important part of that. So for me, the problem that UBI solves is how do you get money to the people? How do you distribute money to the people? And if the way we get people their money is broken, is not efficient, then that can cause lots of downstream symptoms. So I'd say that a lot of the things that people identify as the problem that UBI solves are really downstream of this more kind of fundamental function that UBI serves that we're failing to properly provide. So, for example, so we talked about jobs, right? If you're sitting there and you're the government and you're saying, "Gosh, how do I push a bunch of money into the economy?" Um, if your answer is, well, what if we create a bunch of jobs and hand it out sorry, what if we create a bunch of jobs and push money to consumers that way as workers, right? Employ them as workers, then are we really creating those jobs because we want the product of the labor, or are we creating them, as a mechanism to distribute money to consumers? So we need to be, I think, more conscious of that, right? If you're bringing the economy to full employment, why are you doing that? right? You're trying to get money to people. You're trying, like, why do you want them to have jobs? You're thinking about it as they're being productive, but as soon as you start creating jobs for a reason other than the product of the labor, then maybe you're not actually being as productive as you could be. So the first part of your question was, why don't you need taxes to fund UBI? Um, I would say that generally speaking, if you want to be efficient as a government, you are not going to try to map on tax revenue to specific spending, right? So there's like an optimal taxation pattern. We don't know what it is, but we're trying to get there. And there's an optimal spending pattern. We don't know what it is, but we're trying to get there. As soon as you try to lock these things together, then you're not going to be able to achieve the optimal pattern of both. So that could just be an argument that, like, okay, we don't want to earmark specific money for specific spending, but maybe it should still balance or something like that. Um, there's a reason why I think it's important that they do not balance, and that is that the economy needs um, money flowing into it at all times, and we solve that problem now through kind of the private sector. This is People are like, "What are you even talking about?" when I say this kind of thing. But I like to say that the government is inducing the private sector to print money for us. So there's all this money printing going on, but it's happening in the financial sector, in the private financial sector, and it's leaking out to some people through jobs. So we stimulate the private financial sector to generate all this money and push money to people through jobs, but a lot of it just kind of stays there, and you get this excessive financialization and financial instability, and and the idea with UBI is that instead of having this money faucet where money's constantly flowing into the economy that's kind of coming from the private sector, it's really inefficient, it's overemploying people and generating financial instability. You can turn on this other money faucet where you're just handing people money directly. And then you can rein in the financial sector. You can say, like, okay, we don't need to kind of stimulate the banks and all of that in order to keep money flowing in the economy. We can just do it more directly, and that is kind of so the answer, I guess, to the question of why you don't need money to why you don't need taxes to fund a basic income, or why it doesn't make sense to think of taxes as funding the UBI, is that you need new money to be constantly flowing into the economy. And that's the problem that UBI solves. There's another problem of, where does the money end up, right?
Right.
If you are adding a bunch of money to the economy, and money's flowing into the economy at all times, even if it's not causing inflation, which, we're doing it now, right? We're not doing it in the form of UBI, we're doing it in the form of stimulating the financial sector and that kind of thing. And it's not causing inflation in terms of, like, the purchasing power of money, but it is causing inflation in the wealth of the ultra rich, and asset prices and all of that, right? So that's another problem, right? There's this problem of, where does the economy's money come from, and that's a problem that UBI can solve. And then there's this problem of, where does that money go? And that's not a problem that UBI solves. So it could be that the answer to that is, okay, we need taxes pulling the money out, right? To prevent maybe rich people from getting too rich, or to other kinds of things. There's so depending on where you draw the line between what's money and what's not, maybe rich people aren't accumulating money, they're accumulating other financial assets. You can kind of get into kind of like all the nitty gritty. But I think the big picture kind of takeaway here is that there are two money faucets that we get to choose a balance between. There's, okay, we are pushing money out into the economy through the financial sector, and stimulating borrowing by firms so that they hire workers and pay wages. And then a side effect is that a lot of money gets created for other reasons too, versus we just hand people money directly as the government. So these are two faucets. If you increase the UBI, instead of increasing the taxes to kind of like balance it out in some sense. What you can do is you can tighten the financial sector. Tighten that other tap, that other money faucet, so that there's less money flowing in this really inefficient, dysfunctional way, and there's more money that's just being handed out to people.
So it sounds from what you've just described that this is the antithesis, but a mirror to Reaganomics, trickle down economics. This idea of providing benefits to the wealthy through tax cuts to corporations and high income earners, and try to generate innovation and job creation. And the resulting benefits were that it was supposed to trickle down to the rest of society. So that was the supply side. But you're arguing for the demand side, which is a trickle up type of economics where UBI provides direct unconditional cash payments to all citizens, which would create an income floor from which wealth could therefore move upwards, be spent, although, as you just said, it's not built into the apparatus that you must spend, right? And on what goods, on which goods. I find that fascinating because Reaganism has been, and Thatcherism, I guess together, have been credited with much of the ills in later decades to our economy. I'm wondering, given that MMT distinguishes between the government, the issuer of currency, and citizens or businesses, a sovereign issuer cannot run out of money and can always meet any debt obligations denominated in their own currency. But that would only really apply to countries that print their own currency readily, right? So I'm wondering how UBI would it change class relations if it came together with, let's say, taxation as it was implemented during, I believe, FDR, where the super rich were taxed. And super rich in the early part of the 20th century was another level of money. Still, I think at one point, the United States, for people earning over, if I'm not mistaken, 300,000 US dollars, were being taxed at rates in excess of 90%.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things there. I think first I want to speak to this idea of kind of monetary sovereignty that MMT talks about, where if you're a government that issues its own currency, they use the term currency for this in particular. If they issue their own currency and they only borrow in that currency, etc., then they kind of can't run out of money. They can't run out of money if that's what they're doing. At least in they can't run out of at least the little pieces of paper that they're issuing, right? Because they're issuing them. But I would I wouldn't draw the stark contrast between the government and firms and everyone else. I would say that it's generally true that you can't run out of things that you issue, whether you're the government or anyone, right? So so you can't run out of promises. I can make as many promises as I want. What I can run out of is the capacity to keep those promises, right? So when the government is issuing currency, issuing money, what are they promising? Well, generally, they're promising some amount of stability in the purchasing power of the money, so it can be traded for a consistent amount of stuff, that kind of thing. MMT talks about this as there's an inflation constraint. Like, you can print as much money as you want, spend as much money as you want, but if you do too much, you're going to have inflation or something like that. I would maybe say even more strongly, if you do not manage your money in a way that is consistent with stable purchasing power, consistent with monetary stability, then people are going to find something else. The market is going to find something else to use as its money. And that doesn't really make sense if you're thinking about it in MMT terms, because for MMT, money is whatever the government collects in taxes, right? It's a tax credit. But for me, how I define money, and the concept that I want to understand when I understand money isn't, how do I understand the government's tax credits, right? That's not what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand the means of payment for everybody, right? And the means of payment for everybody is also going to be the means of payment for the government, right? It's going to be what they accept in taxes. But it's not that the government can just come out here and declare, okay, sand is money now, right? because we're collecting taxes denominated in sand, and suddenly everyone's going to start using that as their standard means of payment, right? That's not how money works. The reason why we use a certain payment standard is because other people, not just the government is a big other people, but other people are kind of on the same standard as us. Money is like language. We all speak the same language, so we can talk to each other. We all use the same money, so we can make payments with each other in kind of a standard reckoning and all of that. So I would say that money is fundamentally the standard means of payment for everybody in the economy, and that in order for the economy to use something that the government issues as their money, the government has to be, has to manage it in a way that makes it usable by the market. So that's a very not just the market, but anyone as a means of payment, and that's different from the MMT story. So then, what does it mean? What does it mean then to like you can always run out of something that you don't issue, and you can always be constrained in terms of what you can issue, because if you issue too much, you're no longer providing a valid monetary standard, that kind of thing. And I think, with respect to deficits, where I land is going to kind of end up being similar to where MMT lands anyway. They would use those deficits potentially to mobilize labor, to provide employment to people who would otherwise be unemployed. And I just want to say that. What was the next part of your question?
In the MMT view, the government must spend money into the economy before it can be collected back as taxes. Therefore,
Right.
taxes do not fund spending. Instead, they serve to create demand for the currency and act as a brake to cool the economy.
Yeah.
What would UBI do in such a moment where are taxes collected after then and not before?
Well, if you're living in a world with finance where borrowing is possible, then the as long as those mechanisms are working correctly, the order of things really starts to not matter at all. Do you tax before you spend, or do you spend before you tax? Doesn't really matter. If you tax first and then spend, that's fine. If you spend first and then uh, tax, that's also fine. I guess if you're trying to go back to time zero, like where did that money come from? Well, if you're taxing first before you spend, then I suppose the money had to be created in the private sector, and if you're spending first before you, like someone had to borrow in the private sector in order to pay you, and if you're spending before you tax, then you're the government. You had to borrow before you, but it doesn't really matter. The economics shake out the same way, and I think that's an odd thing I see MMT do, is they emphasize spending before taxing rather than taxing before spending. It doesn't matter. It's the economics are the same either way. So yeah, I guess that's what I have to say to that.
Well, I guess a lot of people on the right do not agree with UBI. And I'm wondering if you know of economists who support it, because some people on the right actually do see the benefits of UBI or other similar systems in order to, frankly, not collapse the economy. Because now let's go to a few facts here. We've been covering this on the show and in many of the articles we run. The enormous loss of jobs, especially since lockdown. So the pandemic shock globally, according to the International Labour Organization, it estimates that 114 million people lost their jobs. We know this number to be much more anyways. In the global south, there's a lot of informal jobs. Underemployment, even in countries like ours, the US, is not always calculated in unemployment statistics, or how are freelancers also calculated, even the nouveau lumpenproletariat. We can talk about class too in this, because I've been making the argument now for many years that my students at NYU in the late 90s were asking me for letters of recommendation for unpaid internships because the job market was so bad that their options were Starbucks often, going and getting a master's. I guess I'll get a master's. And I would encourage them to think through this because I saw already by the financial collapse in the late 90s that things were going downhill. So when you take into account the pandemic crunch from 2020, then from 2022 to now, actually, there are layoffs in the tech sector. They're trying to right size, as they call it. So you've got that. But there's more than just that afloat. And then we've got problems of all these other jobs that I just mentioned that are not calculated. So let's just pretend everyone loves their jobs and they're losing their jobs, okay? Let's just pretend. We know that's not the case, but I guess I'm trying to think through how UBI would both distribute money so that it's money and currency flows within the market, at the same time correcting social ills, if I might say, or social injustice vis-a-vis the fact that the money of the elite has amassed. Hence, I point to lockdown. And there was just a world population study released a few weeks ago, which shows that the wealth of the rich has been localized more and more in fewer hands. The rich have gotten more wealthy, and the middle class has sunk into the lower class. And that's why I refer to university graduates now are often considered working class because they are unable to find work, not even meaningful work. Work is a thing now, something that in my generation we didn't see. It was easy to get a job mowing lawns, get a babysitter, working at a Starbucks, working at a McDonald's, and up and up and up until you get your dream job. Today, this is no longer the case.
Well, I like to say that there are important problems that UBI does not solve, and this is one of them, right? It's not going to solve inequality, injustice, the excessive accumulation of wealth. Like these are really important problems that, that's not what UBI is really about. I think there are some people who try to, okay, so for me, that's not what UBI is about. There are some people who try to kind of promote UBI as a solution to inequality and some of these things. Instead, what I would say is that UBI provides a function. It provides money distribution into the economy, and when that's not functioning properly, it can make some of these other things worse. But it doesn't get to the root of some of these other problems, right? It gets to the root of its own problem. And it's true that when you implement a UBI, if that induces tighter monetary policy, then asset prices are going to come down. And during that transition into the UBI world, a lot of wealth might come off the balance sheets of the ultra rich. They might become less ultra rich. But then once you're living in a UBI world, it's still possible for people to accumulate, outsized wealth, etc., unless you do something about it. And UBI alone doesn't do anything about that. So, you might want to pair UBI with some taxes, or you might just want to think, okay, we've got the UBI working. That's good. We're good there. And then you don't have to think of the taxes as being paired with the UBI. You think of it as kind of like the taxes are solving this other problem of kind of maybe pulling excess money off of the economy, that kind of thing, preventing rich people from getting too rich. Depending on how you want to do your taxes, there are other ways of getting money out of the hands of people before they become, Elon Musk, that kind of thing. Maybe the government sells some kind of like I don't know, badge or something that you can only buy if you have $1 billion or something like that, and you want to show it off. But, like something like that, like, oh, that's one way to, like if you can get rich people to like want to hold one of these badges as a form of prestige, like, oh, look, I was the only one who could afford this thing or whatever. Like, that's over. I don't think anyone would go for that. But, there are various ways of pulling money out of the economy, and UBI does not solve that problem.
Though there are people who fear UBI because they claim it could be inflationary without the anchor of job guarantees to stabilize wages. I'm thinking of some of the mainstream economists who criticize this, and I'm thinking of Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, who have raised concerns of inflation risk, political accountability, and that they claim it's untested in practice, but a lot of things are untested in practice. That's sort of a throwaway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think people who are worried about inflation, they're thinking about UBI as additional money, right? That you're adding to the economy. It's money that wasn't there before. So if you're not kind of pulling money out simultaneously to adding money to the economy, then Now there's just more money flowing. So, are you going to have the capacity to meet that additional money flowing, that kind of thing? If people have less incentive to work, is that actually going to hurt the supply side because, we're actually not going to produce as much because people aren't working as much? Yeah, these are kind of the standard concerns. What I like to emphasize is that money is not more money. Or sorry, UBI money is not more. UBI is not more money. It is a different source of money. It's an alternative source of money, right? So this is what I was talking about before with the faucets. Right now we use monetary policy, right, to push money into the economy. UBI can be an alternative to that. The next time the Fed wants to lower interest rates, we can say, "Hold up, Fed. Instead of you doing that, we're going to increase the UBI over here, and we can keep interest rates higher. We can keep monetary policy tighter. We can keep credit conditions tighter so that you're not going to have as many runaway asset bubbles, and instead you're pushing money to people directly." So I think that's the answer. Is that if you do too much, then that's inflation. If you do not enough, then either it's deflation or you have to have some other way of pushing money into the economy. And what we have is some other way of pushing money into the economy that is really dysfunctional. So it's instead of that.
Right. You've argued that a properly tuned UBI can actually end the business cycle by ensuring that necessary businesses never fail due to an artificial scarcity of consumer spending, which this would, in fact, supply. And then, if that is so, this is my next question. And this is, again, it sort of falls outside of the category of what UBI can do. But I'm just thinking hypothetically, if UBI, we've seen it's being tested in certain places here in the EU, for instance, but they limit it very, very much. Do they limit it? So, in a way, it's a test that's destined to just not give proper results, because I think you'd need to run it more widely than a certain demographic in this small town. However, that said, we saw what happened with Amazon during lockdown. People were ordering from Amazon because they couldn't leave their houses. It was a great pyramid scheme in a certain sense. So we made Jeff Bezos wealthier, and at the same time, we're seeing the collapse of businesses here in Italy. So many businesses still now collapsing. Just recently, I've seen so many in my neighborhood collapse. And this is all resultant from lockdown and other factors, but it kicked off with lockdown. So I'm wondering, if people are given money every month, would this in fact support more local business? Is there a way to incentivize these kinds of flows of money towards the local and not the online Jeff Bezos getting rich?
So the simple answer is no. Money is money. You're going to spend it where you spend it, right? There's no reason why handing people money is going to cause them to spend that money at local businesses rather than just buying more stuff off Amazon. I guess that's the simple answer. If you want people to buy from local businesses, you're going to have to do something other than just a UBI, or in addition to a UBI. But I think it's worth questioning that goal. Like, why do we care about local businesses, right? Is that the best way to allocate our resources, to have kind of like stuff being produced and sold locally, and each town has its kind of own productive ecosystem or something like that? Maybe there's an argument to be made that okay, it's not very resource efficient. It's not as sustainable as kind of a centralized production hub, but maybe it's, good for human well-being or something like that, to feel like more people are kind of contributing locally to their local community, and everyone's kind of more socially integrated through that kind of context. Yeah, you could. It's not the problem that UBI solves, and I think UBI is not about supporting businesses at all, right? And when I think about the economy, I don't care about businesses, right? Businesses are only important insofar as they support the people, in my view, right? It's not like I want the economy to be healthy, let's help the businesses, right? No, I want to help the people, and to the extent that you need businesses for that, okay, we can also have businesses. But if you don't need businesses, that's also fine. Or sometimes you need some businesses but not others, and et cetera, et cetera. So UBI is not going to help you with anything, keeping anything local, unless you add some other twist or something like that.
Has UBI been tested in any cities or states in the US?
Well, it depends on what you mean by UBI and what you mean by tested. Certainly, there are many direct cash assistance kind of schemes that have been piloted in various places in the U.S. The U.S. is among the direct cash, community. The U.S. is famous for kind of being this testing ground where there are always, dozens of pilots going on in different cities and that kind of thing. But I think you made a good point, right? Which is, what do we learn from that, right? Do we learn anything about UBI? If the main effect of UBI is macroeconomic, like what do we learn when we hand people direct cash in the context of our current economy? We learn that people are better off when they have more money. I don't know if that's something we needed to run an experiment on, right? So UBI in the macroeconomic sense is not something that has really been tested, and it's not something that you asked before about economists supporting UBI. Some of them do, but most of them are not thinking about the macroeconomics of UBI. They're thinking of UBI as, okay, is it an alternative to, another form of redistribution or something like that? Like the macroeconomics is here, and now we're fiddling around with, okay, there's some people who are left behind. How do we kind of reallocate, that kind of thing? That's not, where I'm coming from at all either. So it's really, you're right that the UBI in the sense that I'm talking about, in terms of the things that are important that it does, has not been tested explicitly. But you brought up the lockdown, right? And everybody, a lot of people staying home from their jobs and buying stuff on Amazon, right? I think this kind of the economy still kind of worked even when most people weren't working. Yeah, there were problems, there were supply chain problems, etc. But I think it really, that moment got people to question, well, how many of these jobs do we actually need? How is it possible that we can divide people into essential workers and non-essential workers, right? The non-essential workers stay home. It's like, well, if they weren't essential, then what were they? Maybe it was better to have them working, but was it? I don't know. So when the pandemic happened, that was awful. But I was kind of hoping that it would help people see that maybe keeping everyone in jobs is not always going to be the answer.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Well, that's my next question. How do we get around this? Because I think of the Protestant work ethic, and this is something that permeates our society, where having a job is good, not having a job, bad. And there are moral judgments around this. And there are a lot of moral judgments around this. We see this from, again, going back to Reagan era, and the way in which people who receive money because of unemployment are deemed to be lazy, worthless, etc., etc. And this is a huge hurdle, I would assume, to get UBI accepted, because this is going to divide. And I'm not talking about the Jeff Bezos of the world from us. I'm talking about middle-class Americans who see value in having a job, pride in putting on your uniform. If I go to work every day, why do those bums have to stay at home playing video games? We can hear what's going to be said. It's been said. How do we break that nut? Because that's a huge one. That's the basis of a lot of societies. Italy's constitution is built on the right to work.
Yeah. Well, you're an anthropologist, right?
Right.
Emically speaking, right, within our culture and within our society, we think that it's important for people's psychological well-being and their social standing and everything to contribute to society, and they have a job and they derive meaning and purpose from a job, and this is fundamental to how human beings are. It's kind of baked into our psychology, but this is also at the same time, if people don't work, then everything falls apart because all the value of society comes from labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The etic explanation. So this is, you're looking at, some alien comes to our planet and says, like, what is this work ethic about? Why are people working all these jobs when clearly they're the resources available that they don't have to be working as much, that kind of thing. They'd be saying like, oh, okay, I see what's happening. So people derive meaning and purpose from their work. And a big part of that is because it makes them better workers, right? If there's an employer that wants to hire some people, and some of the applicants are just doing it for the money, and other applicants are doing it because, they feel like a connection to the work and like that it's part of their core being, that kind of thing. Which ones are going to get hired? Oh, the ones who feel, that work is, part of their identity, right? So then everybody ends up feeling that work is part of their identity, and the psychology of work and labor and being a worker and having that identity. Also, like, okay, if everybody's kind of a worker, then it makes it easier to organize around a working class, because now you have a common identity under which you can kind of like hold up your banner and say, like, we are the workers, and we've got this story about how we're the ones who are creating like the value in society or something like that. I like to say, like, this is probably kind of connects up with some of your thinking, but in a different way, that the whole working class worker movement is a kind of identity politics, right? It's like, we are workers, and that's why we have value, instead of, we are people, and we all care about people, and but then there's no enemy, right?
Right,
If you're
right.
just thinking about people as people.
And I guess with the UBI, the EDIC analysis would measure the mathematical poverty gap reduction, and an EMIC would view that and ask its recipients if they feel more dignified or free to pursue other work, as we're
Hmm.
seeing now in certain countries that are rolling out basic credits for artists. Many countries already had this where if you were an artist, you could stay and do your art, you received a pension, you weren't doing nothing, you were creating art. You just were not necessarily Tracy Enham or others being exhibited at the National Gallery. So there was always a place. I think the great thing about UBI is that it will give these kinds of jobs a pay structure of a sort.
Yeah. I think, the thing about having targeted cash benefits that go to you, like, for being an artist, or having a particular role in society, is that, okay, now in order to get that money, you have to perform that role, right? Okay, there's an artist subsidy, and I need the money. Okay, how do I convince, the government that I'm an artist? And who ends up getting the money? The ones who would have been artists anyway, or the ones who are really good at kind of playing the role of artist? It gets pretty messy, pretty quickly, I think. And one of the nice things about UBI is that it's obligation free. You don't have to do anything. You're just a person, right? And that's what we care about ultimately anyway. We don't, like, artists, sure, but, like, why is that something that specifically needs to be subsidized, right? That feels like, okay, there's something that's broken in the economy, and it's kind of like a band-aid over like a patch over this problem that we haven't solved, right? We haven't solved the underlying problem. For some reason, the structure of our economy is broken so that people can't be artists, right? In a way that is dignified or sustainable or something like that. So we're patching that particular symptom rather than addressing the underlying problem.
True. I'm thinking always in terms of the critic of UBI who will come along and say, well, people are getting money for doing nothing, and therefore we won't have emergency workers because everyone will want to stay at home and nobody will want to be an ambulance driver, nurse, doctor. These are things that will be said by some. There are three main criticisms of UBI: fiscal feasibility, the
Hmm.
policy trilemma, cost versus adequacy, where economists often cite this trilemma where UBI schemes can only achieve two of three goals: being universal, adequate, or affordable. And they argue about the massive fiscal cost. For instance, providing a livable income to every citizen is colossally expensive. This is what they argue. And they say a modest 400 quid a month in the UK would cover over 200 billion annually, exceeding the entire NHS budget. So their argument is we can't give people money because the NHS will be underfunded, even though it's a derail, really. They argue that it's an unsustainable tax burden, and they talk about inefficiency of universality. What say you to that?
Well, I'll start with the universality, which is that I actually several years ago I emailed Darren Acemoglu, and he responded by with this argument that universality is inefficient. Like you could just target the people who need it, and if you do universality, then for some people you're going to be handing them money and then taking it back again, and that's really inefficient or something like that. And I would say the opposite, that if you want to do targeting, you can, but do it through taxation. Hand everybody their money, and then if you want to target certain people and not have them have as much money, you can tax them, and that simplifies the money distribution side, right? You're not in any danger of some people who need the benefit not receiving it or something like that, right? There's no requirement to perform to receive money. There's a requirement to for the government to do the work of targeting and figure out who they need to take the money from, right? So I think that gets the incentives uh, right on the side of the government. So that's universality, and you can do that. But I think there's a deeper problem here, which is that people are thinking of UBI as a form of social assistance or as like an alternative to welfare, a form of welfare. They're comparing it to programs like the NIH. They're comparing it to food stamps or welfare programs, Dole, that kind of thing. That's not the standard of comparison. The standard of comparison is monetary policy, right? Where does the economy's money come from? It's not like you can try to use UBI as a welfare program, and there are people who argue like, oh, there's administrative inefficiency if you try to make people jump through hoops. And it's like, yeah, of course, all of that is true, but that's not really what UBI is deeply fundamentally doing. And if you're talking about UBI in the conversation of welfare programs, you're kind of missing the point, right? The central bank is overstimulating the financial sector to pump money into the economy. There's all this money that's being printed by the private financial sector that doesn't need to be. And that's in terms of I just want to emphasize again that UBI is not a particular amount of money. It's a way of getting people money, right? So it's an alternative to pushing money into the economy through easy monetary policy. Now, if everybody's hung up on how do you provide a livable amount or something like that, um, that's gonna you're gonna be having a different conversation. I, you know, my intuition is that in certain countries, the optimal level of UBI would be a livable amount or higher than livable amount. But that's a different conversation from whether the UBI itself as a mechanism is a good money distribution mechanism. And that's a different question from the question of, well, how much, benefit do we want the government to be providing directly, and then to what extent do we want people to have money in order to buy the things they want, right? There are some things that are more efficiently provided as direct services by the government, and there are some things that are more efficiently allocated by the market or claimed as through spending money, right? That kind of thing. That's a separate debate too. Like maybe someone says like, okay, we actually don't want people to be getting any of the things they want by spending money. Well, then there's no role for UBI, right? Then you don't have money in your economy. But as soon as you have money in your economy, you have to figure out where that money is going to come from, right? And it can come from borrowing in the private sector. It can come from borrowing by the government, right? Money is created through borrowing. That's where, kind of money comes from. And having more UBI and less expansionary monetary policy means you're shifting that balance toward more government money creation and less private sector money creation. Obviously, the government spends money in other ways besides UBI, there can be money going into the economy that's paying for labor in the MMT story or buying other services, that kind of thing. But kind of that's the picture to have. I don't, like most of the people who are thinking about UBI are not thinking about it in this way. They're thinking about it as a more efficient form of welfare. You brought up the other thing about is like the solution to AI and automation and technology eliminating jobs. It's like, well, why is this a crisis? Why are we living in a world where people not having to work as much is actually harmful to people, right? This is strange. It's a puzzle, right? And it's because we don't have UBI. It's because we've structured our economy so that people have to get their money through jobs, right? And we've structured our culture so that, work is having a job is expected. It's part of your identity, meaning and purpose, that kind of thing. It's kind of in our psychology now. How much of our psychology is baked in, and how much of it is cultural adaptation that we've internalized, in order to be successful members of society, in order to thrive within the current, kind of cultural context, that kind of thing. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know, we brought up, imagine you do have a UBI. Like, what if people do need jobs? Like, well, maybe they do need, people do need to do something. They, like, we don't want people just sitting around as lumps. So I would ask the question, if you want to create jobs for people, so that they have meaning and purpose, if you want to create activities for them to do, are the kinds of jobs we would create for that purpose, if we're being intentional about it and being explicit about it, are those jobs the jobs that we're creating today using expansionary monetary policy? And I would say very much not, right? If we are intentional about, okay, you know, we want to provide meaning and purpose for people, what kinds of activities do we want to put resources into creating for people to do? It would look very different. I don't know, maybe there'd be more people playing sports or exploring, or going on adventures, or something like that. And maybe some of the work would look more like a current job, people doing their own, blacksmithing or crafts, or something, but we would acknowledge that, like, okay, this isn't actually, like, we're not doing this for the output, right? We're doing this because people like to do stuff, and we're actually putting resources into it, right? We're admitting that, okay, this actually uses up resources, but it's worth it because it's providing benefit to people, right?
Well, yes, and this is why when I read the comments or the criticisms of UBI, I realize people are fearful of the robots taking over because we don't have laws that guarantee. For instance, I live near a Lidl here, and they've started the machines, and I won't use them. And I know my contribution. I'm not the only one, by the way. I have a lot of other people in the queue, and we're just waiting for someone to come. Ironically, I don't think that there's a great understanding, even in a country like Italy, of what will happen if AI were to take over, because there's no plan. There was more of a pandemic plan, even though it
Yeah.
wasn't followed, than an AI plan. The government has not, no governments really, to my knowledge, have come up with a plan that should companies lay off people due to AI, they are obliged to still pay them, or they were obliged to put this into the system. Nowhere. Yet we know now that AI can even do the jobs of the reason for all these computer programmers being laid off is also because AI is doing their jobs. There's a bit of a conflation here. For instance, the second critique of UBI are the critiques regarding economic and labor concerns. That inflationary pressure, increased disposable income across the population can drive up demands for goods and services faster than the supply can grow, leading to price inflation that erodes the actual purchasing power of UBI payments. Other people say this will reduce the motivation to work, and other people say that this will create wage and productivity stagnation. Okay, so you take all this together, and even the reduced motivation to work is separate from social and philosophical objections, which gets more Weberian. Could you speak to the concerns about economics and labor? Let's just start with the reduced motivation to work. Will a guaranteed income reduce people's motivation? Like you said earlier, we didn't need to run a test to see if people getting money will improve their lives. We know that already. But something has shifted since the pandemic, and I mean massively shifted. People are super worried about how they're going to eat now in ways that we haven't seen before amongst the former middle class. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to the first part is yes. Of course, UBI is going to reduce people's motivation to sell their labor, right? That's part of the point. You don't have to make up jobs for people. You don't have to. You don't, if you're not pushing money to people through jobs anymore, then that frees up a lot of other possibilities, right? If you're so UBI is an alternative to kind of forcing people to get their money through jobs. If you're not forcing people to get their money through jobs, then they're not going to have as much incentive to get their money through jobs, right? And I think that's fine. And I think people are, when they make this argument, they're worried that, oh, but if people aren't going to work as much, then the economy isn't going to have the labor it needs, or something like that. But I would argue that the demand for labor is artificially inflated as a way of getting people jobs, right? We overstimulate the financial sector to get firms to borrow, so they hire workers, right? Um, UBI means not having to do that. So yeah, people aren't going to want to sell their labor as much necessarily, right? So that's a reduced labor supply. There's less labor available. But at the same time, you're reducing labor demand, right? There's not as much demand for labor because the demand for labor was artificially inflated. The available jobs for people to work was in excess of what's actually productive for the economy, right? And this kind of like, you hear this fear that people aren't going to work as much at the same time that you hear this fear that there aren't going to be enough jobs available, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. Don't those things, like, isn't it good if those things kind of go together? There aren't as many jobs available and people don't want to work as much. That sounds perfect, right? That sounds balanced, right? Or it could be balanced. Those effects could be balanced. And UBI allows us to balance those effects. The people who worry about AI taking jobs, they are looking at the technology side. They're looking at the power of the technology to save labor, to eliminate work, right? What they're not looking at they're not looking at, hey, economic policy is actually geared toward full employment, right? This is the Keynesian thing. This is we're not full MMT, but we do run our economy as if like we're trying to create jobs for people. The conventional way we do that is through monetary policy. Maybe AI makes it so that even if you have easier credit, right, and firms are borrowing more, they actually don't hire more workers. Maybe instead of hiring more workers, they buy more data center space or something like that, right? And then there's inflation um, in memory prices and so, that kind of thing. But it's so we might run out of that particular lever, right? You can imagine AI making it so that you can't really use monetary policy to bring the economy to maximum employment anymore. But that doesn't mean there aren't other ways to do it, right? We could have a job guarantee, right? MMTers talk about it all the time. You could have a job guarantee forever. It doesn't matter how powerful AI gets. You can have a job guarantee forever. You can have people working. There are ways to generate jobs for people. The question isn't, do we have to be worried that the jobs are going to go away? The question is, do we really want to keep people in jobs? Is that how we want to structure our society? Now, of course, there are disruptions, like individual jobs are being eliminated. There's, a huge, tech sector adjustment going on right now. And, throughout history, industrial revolution, there are always workers who are displaced, like, the Luddites smashing the looms. We look back on that and we laugh and we're like, ha ha ha, there were actually more jobs, like they were idiots, the economy actually progressed and, everybody, became wealthier, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those workers didn't, right? They actually, did kind of get, screwed over by the system, right? Those jobs were gone and they weren't coming back. And there's periods like that throughout history, but we always come out and kind of keep going and make up jobs for people, not for everyone. Like people get left behind and there are a lot of social problems and all of that, but we can kind of keep limping along. And I don't think there's anything about the AI wave or the AI boom that's going to prevent us from continuing to do that. What we really need, you talked about having a plan. What we really need is a plan for us to get out of this cycle of constantly generating jobs and enough jobs to kind of keep enough people employed that, we can kind of keep going on with this broken system. An important part of that plan is UBI. So some people are worried, hey, UBI is the solution to AI eliminating all these jobs. And I would say it's more the other way around. It's more, you can't eliminate the unnecessary labor unless you have a plan for how you're going to get people money, right? Otherwise, we keep generating jobs, right? So UBI allows us to reap more of the benefit of labor-saving technology because we're not going to counteract it through full employment policy.
I think that the problems in getting a policy so that all of us are not worried about what we're going to lose. I'm an example of this. My classes this past semester were put online. A robot taught for me. There I was trying to help out the Lidl clerks, but my job was AI'd.
Wow.
No, it's phenomenal. It's grotesque too, I have to say, because I'm not pro online education unless for people who are facing issues of mobility and they cannot reach a university hall. Now, I do think that the Protestant work ethic is going to be a huge hurdle for countries like Canada and the US and even England, where there are regular judgments made about people who receive money for doing nothing. And I saw this. I was a professor in Canada for many years, and the comments I saw about people who were living on welfare were horrifying. Or even the comments about Native Americans just outside of Montreal. So, how can we implement a UBI plan that will safeguard people's lives and their survivability on the one hand without rendering some kind of culture war?
Uh, I don't think you necessarily can. I think there's, if you're changing the economy in this kind of radical way, it's going to induce a cultural shift, and that's not going to be easy. So I guess that's what you're asking is how do you have that shift, while minimizing kind of the pain in involved? And I think that's a tough question, and it's something we're going to have to kind of face if we want to do this. And it's something we kind of have to face anyway, because things are happening to the economy that we don't have a choice about.
And could you talk a bit about the housing market and UBI?
Yeah. So the thing about UBI is that it's an obligation-free and location-free source of money. So that means that you take it with you wherever you go. So the housing market, there's something wrong with an economy where people are better off when housing prices go up, right? But we use homes as kind of this investment asset, and we use policy to kind of try to protect that. Like people's wealth is in their homes, right? But ideally, in an ideal world, you'd imagine like, yeah, housing is where people live. We want that to be cheap. We want it to be as cheap as possible, right? But that's not how we've structured our economy. UBI gives us more freedom to do that, and because people will have a source of money regardless of what's going on with housing prices. So ideally, you would want not to have policy that's kind of protecting housing prices. UBI is a location-free income. So that means that you get it even if you're not near where the jobs are. So a lot of the pressure in the housing market has to do with people needing or wanting to live where the jobs are. And UBI takes some of that pressure off. So if you think about economics, price, most people just want to stay where they are and live where they are, and the prices they'll pay kind of the prices that they have to pay to live in the house that they live in, because that's their home, that's their house, they're not going to move. But in economics, we say that prices are set on the margin, right? So there are always some people who are trying to decide where to move, where to live, right? And if there's a UBI, it affects that calculus. And the prices come from the people who actually are moving, who actually are buying and selling homes. And if I've got a high enough UBI, I might be willing to move to a city where the housing prices are cheaper, because I don't need to be near any particular job, that kind of thing. So I might move from New York City to Nashville or something, and you'd see kind of some pressure for housing prices to even out. So prices come down in New York, and maybe they go up in cities where housing is currently cheaper, that kind of thing. But because it gives people more flexibility, there's not this like uh, inelastic competition among renters to kind of drive up prices. So that's an important effect of UBI. The other important effect of UBI in the housing market is that because the UBI allows for tighter monetary policy, you're going to see higher interest rates. So that's going to transmit to higher mortgage rates, right? So it's going to become less affordable to kind of buy a house and get into a mortgage with a really, really high interest rate. So that's going to help bring down the price of the housing itself as well. And you might see more people borrowing less because the borrowing is so expensive to buy houses. You might see people borrowing less when they buy their houses and paying more, with actual money, which is going to bring down the price tag itself. It makes it more expensive for some people, for the people who kind of have to borrow in order to buy a home. And obviously, everybody's got these 30-year contracts that they're already locked into. So it's going to take a long time for these effects to percolate and sort themselves out and that kind of thing. But you can imagine a world that has UBI in it, and mortgages aren't as prominent of a thing, and mortgage loans, and there's more mobility, geographical mobility for people. You can actually go where the housing is affordable, and that will bring the market price of housing, I think, to a more reasonable level.
And couldn't UBI be calculated like they do with certain other items, according to what city? So New York and San Francisco, you'd have higher UBI than you would for Ohio.
Well, I think that would be counterproductive because then you're paying people to live in the more expensive cities, right? So then you're locking people in, and that can actually drive up the housing prices. Like, oh, we're paying you more to live where the housing is more expensive. Uh-oh, housing got even more expensive. Let's pay you even more, right? You could imagine a problem there.
True. I do know that some people worried about the inflationary risk for rent capture. Then landlords would,
Mhm.
regardless of who's being paid what, they would just charge their tenants more, knowing that they were getting this. The whole rentier class itself, I find very problematic from my own philosophical position. But what
Yeah.
could be done in order to, as we're moving forward, there are housing crises for even purchasing in places like the UK, for instance. Doctors, lawyers are not able to get loans. And this has been the case for several years because of how things are structured there. What is the answer if owning a house means basically this is not labor exploitation, but it certainly is housing exploitation? And we're not just talking about these mega companies that rent out. I'm talking about individual landlords. We're seeing a lot of this kind of exploitation. Are rent freezes or rent controls like what's happened in New York the answer? How do we make UBI become something useful without it being exploited by the landlord class?
Well, I think rent control kind of papers over the problem. You're kind of favoring the people who already live there and making it even harder for the people who haven't, who need to move to that location again, right? Because nobody wants to leave their homes, and the existing the housing that is out there at market rate is going to be way more expensive because there are more people competing for fewer units, right? So I am generally against price controls and rent control in general. I think, it does something for some people. It has some benefit for some people and has some negative impact for other people. But I think the costs out generally kind of outweigh the benefits for that kind of thing. But I think UBI can help, right? Because UBI allows you to say, no, I don't want to live here. I'll go somewhere cheaper, right? If you're a landlord, you want to charge as much rent as possible, but you can't collect more rent than people are willing to pay, right? We're living in a world where people are locked into living in a particular spot. So they have to pay, whatever the landlord demands of them, right? They don't have a choice. UBI gives people more choice, more mobility, more flexibility. It means that landlords are going to have to bid down prices in order to attract tenants. And the higher the UBI, the larger the effect, because the more freedom people have to live in even more different places.
Yes, this was the idea around social housing, and it's being constructed in post war England, for instance. If we implement UBI, however, and this is another criticism that comes at it, that it makes one choose between existing welfare services like housing subsidies, disability subsidies. So, how do we decide which welfare services are replaced by the cash payment and which must be preserved to ensure that no one is worse off or left out?
I think that should be a separate conversation, right? Like UBI shouldn't replace any welfare services. If you're living in a UBI world and you discover that, certain welfare services are not needed or anything because everyone's okay or it doesn't need, like, okay, then that's fine. But it's not, it's not one or the other kind of thing. I think, oh, okay, so there is a sense in which there's a trade-off, right? Like if you believe that so let's take food, for example. If you believe that food is most effectively allocated by people spending money, then maybe the UBI is higher, and there's no like direct food benefit. The government's not providing food directly. But if you believe that if you just give people money and ask them to buy food, some people are not, for whatever reason, maybe it's market inefficiency and maybe people make bad decisions or something like that. Some people are going to end up starving if you just hand them money. You got to give them the actual food. If you believe that, then yeah, the government is going to allocate those resources directly. So there's going to be, fewer resources left to be allocated by the market. So that means your UBI is going to be lower. These are trade-offs, right? So there's the question of like, if we want to distribute money into the economy, what do we want the source of the economy's money to be? Do we want it to be wages and jobs? To what extent do we want it to be wages and jobs versus to what extent do we want to hand people money directly, right? That's one question. Then there's the question of what services do we want the government to provide directly versus, what do we want people to maybe use their money to buy? And that's a separate question. So there's the question of, do we have UBI? And then there's the question of the balance between government and market, you could say.
And what do you see on the horizon for UBI in the coming years in terms of a proper experiment? To me, doing what I've seen here in the EU, where they take a smidgen of certain people in a certain medium-sized town, it's not widespread enough to be tested. I'd like to see it being not even tested. I'd like it to be drawn out over several years in larger geographical regions so that we can see what happens and even see if there are societal shifts towards what I was talking about earlier, this kind of Protestant work ethic judgmentalism that does go on in many societies, and just see what happens. Do you see that on the horizon this might be rolled out in some place on the planet?
Yeah, I mean I don't know. I'm not confident, right? But that's kind of what I'm hoping for and what I'm hoping that my work will help kind of like move us toward, right? So we'll see. I mean, for me, the kind of the ideal for UBI is that, well, we already live in a global economy. We already have a global monetary system and a global trade and global production and all of that. Global UBI seems like the ideal, like the kind of purest, thing, right? And then global UBI, open borders, and now we really kind of solve this geographical problem where like, okay, some places are really cheap, prices even out throughout the economy, everything gets more efficient, that kind of thing. This is like me in my mind of like my utopian vision of the future. But what are the incremental steps along the way? I think is what you're asking, and yeah, at what point do we say that we've actually kind of tested a UBI? Because you're right, like handing it to individual people, you're seeing how money affects those people, but you're not changing the economy in which they live. So there are some studies, like there's one by Give Directly in Africa, where they take a whole village and they give people money, and that's kind of like, okay, that's a step in the direction of a real UBI because you have an entire village, and that's an entire cultural context and kind of expectations and judgment. You can see some of maybe some cultural shift there. I'd be curious to see that. Does it have the macroeconomic effects? Well, to what extent can you kind of think of a village as a macroeconomy? They actually look at like, okay, the villages actually trade with each other and that kind of thing. How does it affect that? And what I want to see, like, because I think about monetary theory and, monetary areas and monetary policies, what I really want to see, you know, if we're not talking like a global UBI, for global economy, what I would like to see is at least a UBI at the level of a kind of a monetary area. So you really have this trade-off between UBI and monetary policy, right? Like a UBI for the whole United States, right? You're going to be able to say this. You're going to be able to say like, oh, the Fed wants to lower interest rates. No, we can have more UBI, right? We can have tighter monetary policy, higher interest rates on an ongoing basis, and just anytime the Fed would lower interest rates because you're worried, about potential deflationary pressures or something like that, just increase the UBI. Just keep doing that. I would, that would be amazing. How do we get there? Maybe a smaller country. Like there's this, I think it's the Marshall Islands just started. some kind of pseudo UBI thing. It's not the level of a monetary zone because the Marshall Islands is pegged to the US dollar, but it's, this kind of incremental, like it's a continuum. At what point do we cross the threshold and say like, yeah, that's a UBI and we can kind of see the effects of it? I think depends on what effects what you're looking for, but I guess another question we could ask is which of these exercises is actually moving us in that direction, and which is just kind of performative. Okay, we've run a pilot, and look, people actually didn't work less or something like that. Like even in the UBI community, there are people who argue that like, oh, don't worry, people actually still want to work because people are inherently productive. They're not lazy. That kind of thing. It's like, why are you making this argument? Why do we want people to work more? Like, why is that useful? And I think you're kind of conceding like the cultural context, this work ethic, right? You're like admitting that it's better for people to want jobs. It's better for people kind of not to be quote unquote lazy. So you're kind of like then you're collecting data and you're saying like, oh look, they're actually not. Well, what if that's just like because you actually you gave them money, but they're still living in a culture of Protestant work ethic. So yes, they still have this kind of like psychological attachment to wanting jobs, that kind of thing. I like to say that if the UBI isn't causing people to quit their jobs, then the UBI isn't high enough, and that's something that's okay. That's something that's good. So I don't know. I do feel like a lot of the UBI branded pilot programs and stuff is kind of counterproductive. And there's been a proliferation of them, and they haven't really like gotten kind of more and more advanced and more comprehensive. I was at a conference last year, and someone said, like, look at all these pilot programs we have. This is amazing. Imagine how many pilot programs we're going to have in 10 years. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Is the goal to just have more and more pilot programs, or are we trying to like get somewhere with this? And so I think we need to be careful about the pilot programs. And I don't know, maybe the Marshall Islands thing, maybe the Give Directly thing. People try to argue that the Alaska oil dividend is a kind of UBI. I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical that any of this is kind of really going to move us very far in the direction of a true UBI. And I think one of the biggest hurdles, which is partly why I'm working on it, and partly why I think it's the biggest hurdle, is because it's the thing I'm working on. So, I'm making it maybe more important than it actually is. But the theoretical aspect of it, like how do we understand the economy? What is money, right? Is it a tax credit? Is it a fundamentally labor-based thing? Like, you're imposing a tax to get people to contribute their labor, and the value of money is tied to the value of labor. Well, if that's your theoretical explanation for what money is, then it's going to be hard for you to get to a UBI from that starting point.